vamos a ir comenzando. Pues quisiéramos agradecer a todos, a todas, estar en esta nueva edición del Seminario de la UDIR, Imaginar Nuevos Mundos. En esta ocasión, pues para mí es un gusto y un honor poder presentar a un gran investigador, Saurabh Dube, que es doctor por la Universidad de Cambridge y es profesor investigador en el Centro de Estudios de Asia y África del Colegio de México. Es investigador nacional, nivel 3 en el Sistema Nacional de Investigadores desde 2005. Ha escrito alrededor de 140 artículos y capítulos de libro y editado 30 libros. Los libros de su autoría incluyen Untouchable Past, Stitches on Time, After Conversion, Subjects of Modernity, El Archivo y el Campo, y un quinteto en antropología histórica que comprende sujetos subalternos, genealogías del presente, historias esparcidas, modernidad de historia y formaciones de lo contemporáneo. El doctor Dube ha sido becario de la John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation en Nueva York, del Institute of Advanced Study en Warwick, Reino Unido, del Indian Institute of Advanced Study en Shimla, India, del Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study en Sudáfrica, del Max Weber College en Alemania y del IWM, tendríamos que decir, en Viena, Austria. También ha sido profesor visitante varias veces en universidades como Cornell y Johns Hopkins, y recientemente ocupó la cátedra visitante de Kosambi de Estudios Interdisciplinarios de la Universidad de Goa en India. Pues es un honor estar aquí contigo, Saurabh, y trabajando hoy contigo lo colonial, los postcolonial, estos términos tan importantes en estos momentos del mundo. Así que, ¿quién más que un experto que nos pueda hablar sobre estos temas que nos preocupan? Pues sin más, me gustaría darte la palabra y decirte nuevamente que es un gusto y un honor tenerte hoy con nosotros.
Muchas gracias, Mariana. Es un placer y un privilegio estar aquí. Agradezco la invitación a la doctora Mariana Macera, así como a los doctores Mario Martínez Salgado y al doctor Luis Mateo Pineda por su esfuerzo. Y por supuesto, a todos ustedes por estar aquí virtualmente en Zoom, Facebook y YouTube. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. I thank Dr. Mariana Macera for the invitation, Dr. Mario Martinez Salgado, and Dr. Luis Mateo Pineda for the organization. And of course, all of you for being here virtually on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Aquí hay una pregunta crítica. ¿Por qué se está impartiendo en inglés una charla sobre lo decolonial, lo colonial y lo postcolonial en México? Hay una respuesta simple, así como más preguntas críticas. Al recibir la invitación, me ofrecí a hablar en español. Mi inglés es mejor. La decisión fue de los organizadores. Pero algunas preocupaciones que siempre me han molestado son las siguientes. Es el español subordinado al inglés en nuestros mundos de hoy, no también una lengua de los colonizadores, teniendo en cuenta, digamos, quechua o náhuatl, o el hindi, mi idioma. No se ha convertido en una fuente de poder de la nación hindú sobre los habitantes que hablan mundari o gundi. ¿Qué afirmaciones hago sobre el Chhattisgarhi o el Marathi, también mis idiomas, o el Bengalí, la idioma de Ishita, mi pareja? ¿Qué hay las disputas y ironías de los colonialismos, nacionalismos, monolingües? ¿Y qué pasa, monolingües, perdón? ¿Y qué pasa cuando hablar también con sujetos en otros mundos conectados y críticos? Ahora, ojalá, incluyendo participantes de Estados Unidos a Australia, de Sudáfrica a Inglaterra y India. Finalmente, déjame confesar que aborrezco nacionalismos instintivos y sus presunciones. Son algunas de estas preguntas las que intentaré abordar en la charla de hoy. Rapidly in translation, there's a critical question here. Why is a talk on the decolonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial in Mexico being delivered in English? There's a simple answer, as well as further critical questions. Upon receiving this very generous invitation, I offered to speak in Spanish. My English is better. The decision was up to the organizers. At the same time, certain issues that have bothered me are the following. Is Spanish, subordinate to English in our worlds today, not also a language of the colonizers in relation to, say, Quechua or Nahuatl? Or has Hindi, my language, not become a source of power, immense power for the Indian Hindu nation over the Mundari or Gondi-speaking inhabitants of my republic? What about the contentions and ironies of monolingual colonialism, nationalism? And what happens when we seek to speak simultaneously to subjects in other connected and critical worlds? Finally, let me confess that I abhor knee-jerk nationalisms and their presumptions, their conceits. These are some of the questions that I'll try to implicitly address in today's talk. You know, in all this, I'm reminded of the composer Astor Piazzolla's famous 1987 live concert in Central Park, New York. Piazzolla, as many of us would know, was born in Buenos Aires, grew up in New York, and his parents were from Trani, Italia. At the concert, he started to speak in English, Spanish, and Italian, but very soon switched to, surprise, surprise, just one language. Learning from the maestro, I follow suit. So English it'll be now, at least until the discussion afterwards. In the title of the talk today, it is the middle category of the decolonial that mediates the other two, the colonial and the post-colonial. This is because of the immense immediacy in the present of calls to decolonize. This enormous urgency of decolonization across the world is embodied in BLM, Black Lives Matter, and racial aggrandizements, in Trumpism and Brexit, in authoritarian populisms and nationalist intolerance, in the afterlives of slavery and the expropriation of the indigenous, the presence of settler colonialisms, the interrogations of apartheid, and the injustices of caste. At the same time, it is equally important to acknowledge the unproductive ambiguities. You know, some ambiguities are productive, but it is important here to acknowledge the unproductive ambiguities that can attend claims to decolonize in the academia, especially considering different registers of the colonial and their entanglements with the nation. Let me quickly rehearse then distinct meanings and reference of decolonization and the decolonial in academic worlds today. There is first decolonization understood as a political process, beginning in the interwar years and lasting through the end of the 1970s. These involved principally the procedures of high politics, but they entailed also energies and imaginaries of anti-colonial nationalisms that were middle class and subaltern. There is also the extension of decolonization to political scenarios elsewhere from the 1980s onwards, from South Africa and the cancellation of apartheid, to Russia, to Eastern Europe, to Afghanistan. Needless to say, there have been critical debates on the nature of mid-20th century decolonization, especially for me, in the work of John Kelly and Martha Kaplan. Second, there is decoloniality in our worlds, in Latin American worlds. There's decoloniality as emerging in the forms first of coloniality of power and later of decoloniality of knowledge. I'll shortly return to these tendencies, which I said emerge from work on and out of Latin America. Third, decolonize and decolonization as referring to widespread contemporary bids to make disciplines more inclusive and representative, which is a progressive liberal impulse. So disciplines not just being of a certain kind of white male prerogative, but disciplines as being more inclusive of people of color, etc., etc. Fourth, decolonial, decolonizing practices as emerging from fresh readings of particular disciplinary practices of the past, their formations overlooked by the liberal or mainstream framings of the disciplines. Fifth, decolonize, decolonial as questioning, as interrogating settler colonialisms and their formations of indigeneity and race, gender and sexualities. Such measures equally articulate indigenous pasts and lives, epistemologies and methodologies, and combine this on occasion with the querying of slavery. Sixth, and finally, decolonize, decolonial as a shorthand in order to intimate a critical and relevant practice of disciplines and academia, theory and methodology. Here is a critical practice that seeks to address the wider asymmetries of gender, sexuality, race, class of social worlds. Thus, this usage can come together with the larger expressions beyond the academe of Black Lives Matter, Occupy, Me Too, and alternative epistemology. I shall return to these imbalances and ambivalences at the end. Apart from the urgencies and ambiguities of calls to decolonize, Mariana, I'm not going too fast, am I? Is that okay? ¿Está bien?
I think it's okay, sí, está bien. ¿Quieres que las preguntas sean todas al final o si hay alguien que tiene una duda? Pero creo que va bien si quieres ir un poquito, hay alguien que quiera un poquito más despacio. Creo que vas bien, Saurabh.
Ok, perfecto. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Thank you.
Apart from the urgency and ambiguities of calls to decolonize, there's also something autobiographical about my having chosen the theme for this talk. My academic formation at the universities of Delhi and Cambridge turned on the perspectives of subaltern studies, historical anthropology, and social theory, based upon the conjunctions, the combinations of archival research and fieldwork. And so, the actual intersections in my work between the colonial, the post-colonial, and the decolonial had to await my move. My move in the mid-1990s to join the faculty of the Centro de Estudios de Asia y África at el Colegio de México. At the Centro, in Colmex, in Mexico, and in Latin America at large, I came to realize that Asia and Africa were envisioned through rather particular optics of space and time. This was true of everyday arenas and scholarly spaces. In these terrains, mestizo Latin America was uncertainly yet readily imagined in the mirror of a demasiado rarefied modern West. Two moves followed. On the one hand, Africa's and Asia's cultural spatial difference and temporal social otherness signified a mark of enchantment, algo bello, something beautiful. On the other hand, Asia and Africa's political economic backwardness entailed a time lag, a lack of modernity, a temporal social spatial inferiority, algo feo, something ugly. Now, as I work towards juxtaposing and connecting critical understandings of Latin America and South Asia, especially in teaching, two loaded terms presented themselves. First, the problems and potentialities of the post-colonial as a concept and perspective. Second, the understandings and articulations of modernity as a historical process of meaning and power. Here, the post-colonial and modernity pointed to the acute linkages between enlightenment and empire, between reason and race, and between colonies, settler and non-settler, and nations, autocratic and democratic. It is the story of these linkages that I tell today. 4 decades ago, Edward Said's seminal study, Orientalism, crucially underscored the mutual entailments of European colonialism and empire with Western knowledge and power. Of course, long before the appearance of this work, there existed several studies of European images of non-European peoples. However, much of this work tended to be principally documentary rather than critical or analytical. Intervening in this field, Orientalism made a persuasive case for the discursive fabrication. Orientalism made a persuasive case for the discursive fabrication, at once ideological and material, of the Orient as an object and identity through the profound dynamic of knowledge and power constitutive of Western empires. Of course, as we shall see, anti-colonial thinking has a longer past than Said's study. Yet his arguments had an unprecedented ripple effect on scholarship. On the one hand, Orientalism highlighted the complicity between earlier imperial imaginings and contemporary academic renderings, earlier imperial imaginings and contemporary academic renderings of the Orient. Well, contemporary academic and everyday renderings of the Orient. Es cotidiano también. On the other hand, Said's work came to crystallize the key emphases and critical tensions of an emergent academic arena, one involving explorations of colonial discourses and imperial representations. There were other key voices, key developments here, from Gayatri Spivak's deconstructionist readings that fashioned against the grain articulations of subjects and subalterns, through to Homi Bhabha's explorations of ambivalence and hybridity in order to challenge singular conceptions of colonial inscriptions, dominance. And of course, many, many others. Such efforts further intersected with overlapping, ongoing struggles around issues of identity and history, especially those undertaken by minorities and feminists. They also acutely engaged post-structuralist theory, expressly endorsing anti-humanist perspectives. Taken together, from the 1980s, discussions and debates on Western representations of non-Western worlds, taken together from the 1980s, discussions and debates on Western representations of non-Western worlds led to the gradual emergence of the field of post-colonial studies, not solely in metropolitan academic arenas, but gradually also in provincial scholarly terrains, from South Africa to South Asia, from Australia and New Zealand to the Americas, from Great Britain to its earlier imperial outposts. I say this because somehow post-colonial is often understood as related only to English. There's also the French colonial, but also as something which is just metropolitan and terribly elite, right? Whereas, but there've been different kinds of post-colonial, which I can elaborate during the discussion. Just as there are different kinds of English and French, so also there have been distinct formations of the post-colonial. Such developments have included the elaborations of the Subaltern Studies project out of India. Drawing on, yet departing from, wider traditions of histories from below, historias desde abajo, the project turned to the category of the subaltern, derived from the writings of the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Here, subaltern was used as a metaphor for the general attribution of subordination in South Asia. Whether such subordination was expressed in terms of class, caste, age, gender, race, or office. At the same time, the project itself has not only been constitutively heterogeneous, formatively not one, but appears distinctly expressed across the decades. Here, especially significant in later years have been the ways in which subaltern as a perspective has served to question dominant knowledges of empire and nation, state and modernity. Now, I postpone such questions for the discussion ahead, while registering that I was trained in the tradition of subaltern studies, engaging and extending it through other critical perspectives, especially historical anthropology. Now, the point now is that post-colonial and subaltern approaches are often elided, often confused with each other. Yet, the two should not be simply conjoined, should not simply be collapsed together. Thus, while post-colonial orientations emerged under the sign of the colony, interrogating empire, the Subaltern Studies project was born under the mark of the nation, questioning dominant nationalism. This is to say that whereas post-colonial understandings privileged colonialism as a historical departure in the making of the modern world, Subaltern Studies project took as its starting point, the requirements of examining, quote, the failure of the nation to come into, of the Indian nation to come into its own. The Indian nation which had failed its poor citizens, its dispossessed subalterns. It is also the case, however. So I'm saying that subaltern and studies and post-colonial perspectives should not be easily collapsed together. It is also the case, however, that from the beginning, critical engagements both with colony and nation have characterized post-colonial and subaltern perspectives. This should not be surprising. To start off, the ideological antecedents of both these approaches, of the subaltern and the post-colonial, lay in long and critical traditions of anti-colonial thought and decolonizing practice. Here, the writings and politics of Franz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Aimé Césaire, and C.L.R. James could acutely influence the very formations of post-colonial scholarship. At the same time, the terms and textures of subaltern studies emerged equally informed by wider anti-imperial sensibilities. Such sensibilities extended from the diverse politics of counter-colonialism and decolonization that began in 1940s through to the events of the 1960s involving critiques of imperialism and racism, embodied, for example, in the dramatic moment of 1968, and the continuation of these struggles into the 1970s across different parts of the world. Together, post-colonial and subaltern studies were preceded and shaped by these wider developments, especially the emergent critiques of reigning paradigms within the disciplines, as well as formations of new perspectives on the left, including combative social sciences, world systems theory, radical peasant studies, and critical revisions of Marxism. You know, when we discuss post-colonial and subaltern and decolonial, we often forget that they didn't come out of nowhere. You know, they came out of particular antecedents, particular yearnings and turnings and churnings which were going on in the world and in academia. You know, subaltern studies, there were three different generations of subaltern studies. So the Pope is Ranjit Guha, who was born, in the early 1920s, and then there is the Midnight's Children generation, who are the second, who are the, so the, if Ranjit Guha is the Pope, the second generation are the Bishop and the Cardinals. They were born in 1947, and after Salman Rushdie, they are the Midnight's generation, and they were my teachers, and some of this are considered the third generation. So, so these people were there in the 60s when a great deal of the questioning of the late 1960s, of radical movements across the world were going on. And this needs to be kept in mind. Indeed, it is important both to guard against readily collapsing subaltern and postcolonial perspectives and to register the key intersections between these inquiries. All of this has also influenced the terms and textures of historical anthropology, especially the study of colonial cultures, as we shall soon see. It is equally connected to decolonial understandings. Apart from the more recent interest in the decolonial and decoloniality, questions of colonialism have appeared in Latin America as occupying a far away, a dim and distant past. This is true of academic and everyday arenas. After 2 centuries of official freedom, the modern nation emerges as unconnected with empire, which is a far off time, a strange space. At the same time, following a Baroque aesthetic, the pasts of the colonial everyday, the pasts of the colonial quotidian are also often presented in celebratory ways. Thus, Coyoacán, the 16th century colonia, neighborhood where we live, has frequently, joyously been described to us by delighted well-wishers as being, well, muy colonial, very colonial. Against these dominant dispositions, an important body of critical thought on Latin America has focused on the subterranean schemes, the pervasive presumptions, and the overwrought apparitions of the modern and the colonial. I'm referring, of course, to the body of work on the coloniality of power and decoloniality of knowledge, which bears linkages with prior traditions in Latin America of dependencia theory and liberation theology. So, of course, I have in mind the work of Enrique Dussel, Walter Mignolo, before that in terms of coloniality of power, Aníbal Quijano, Ramón Grossfogel, Maldonado, who I really like, and so on. I don't need to take the names. This corpus takes as its starting point the first modernity of Southern Europe. This corpus takes as its starting point the first modernity of Southern Europe, as held together by the Renaissance, the conquest of the New World, and the empires of Spain and Portugal, in the margins and the metropolis. It critically considers thereby the place and presence of colonial stipulations of power within modern provisions of knowledge. The writings no less work their way through the second modernity of the global north, constituted by empires of enlightenment and after, holding up a mirror to modernity as a deeply ideological project and a primary apparatus of domination in the past, present, and posterity. Here, the recursive possibility of secular messianic redemption. Here, the recursive possibility of secular messianic redemption often appears as an exclusive future horizon. Indeed, these emphases have formidably foregrounded the Eurocentric propensities and epistemic violence of modernity that is already always colonial, further underscoring the importance of other forms of gnosis and knowing that reveal horizons other than those of the dominant Western modern. Now, I hope I'm not sort of coming up with mouthfuls. I'm summarizing a great deal of scholarship in as accessible a way as possible. So this brings me to a third related tendency. Across the past 4 decades, important exercises in a host of disciplines have seized upon the contradictory, contingent, and contested dynamics of empire and nation. These dynamics were driven by interlocking identities of class and gender and race and sexuality. Such writings have focused on projects of power as shaped by the acute entanglements of the dominant and the subaltern, the colonizer and the colonized, and the metropolis and the margins. They have variously questioned thereby the unchallenged efficacy, the unchallenged efficiency, the unchallenged power accorded to authoritative agendas of empire, nation, modernity, and globalization. Indeed, such scholarship has drawn upon historical, ethnographic, and literary materials to trace also the acute interplay between articulations of time and space. Here I focus on the study of colonial cultures, broadly understood, based on the interplay between anthropology, history, and related disciplines and critical perspectives. At stake are challenges to overarching representations. At stake are challenges to overarching representations of colony and empire, which were true going into the 1970s and 1980s, and which still exist. Overarching representations of colony and empire as complete dystopian projects of power. Exploring the practices, representations, and boundaries of settler peoples, imperial agents, and evangelizing missionaries, such scholarship has not only revealed the crucial dividing lines between different colonial agents and diverse imperial agendas, but it has also underscored that such conflicting interests could often drive a single colonial project. You know, the most wonderful example of this is the work of Jean and John Komarov on South Africa, where they look at the distinctions between British missionary, between evangelical missionaries, Dutch settlers, and upper class British administrators, and they show how the conflicts between them, exactly the conflicts between these different groups, led to the elaboration both of empire and later of apartheid. Moreover, there have been close analyses of the relationship. There have been close analyses of the relationship between the metropolis and the colony, the mutual shaping of European processes and colonial past. From the ways the impulses of empire and their reworking in the colonies brought about changes at the heart of Western history, through to the ways there were conjunctions and contradictions between bids to discipline subject groups at home, the Manchester working class, and efforts to civilize subject population in the colonies, from India to Australia and elsewhere. Third, there have been imaginative analyses of colonial processes. Imaginative analyses of colonial processes as shaping the margins and the metropolis. Colonial processes that turned on space, time, language, the body, and the law. Imperial travel, exhibitions, museum collections, colonial representations, and material exchanges. Culture, consumption, art, and literature. And gender, sexuality, race, and desire. Fourth, several significant studies in this recent genre suggest the importance of tracking the interplay between historical representation, political economy, and state formation, quite as the newer nuanced understanding of culture and power have emerged, bound to powerful reminders that gender and sexuality structured formations of empire. Fifth, remarkable studies have variously explored formations of slavery and race. Remarkable studies have variously explored formations of slavery and race in the making of modernity. Here, race and slavery emerge as lying at the core of colony and nation, mercantilism and modernity, and industrialism and the Enlightenment, as defining their mutual makeovers, their constitutive contentions. Finally, at stake are incisive explorations of the colonial experience in the production of the modern world, from ideological practices to instrumental ideologies. This has meant also formidable rethinking of the past and the present, of the disciplines. This has meant also formidable rethinking of the past and the present, of the world and of disciplines, in view of their connections with colony and empire, alongside the intersections of disciplines with gender and nation. So, this is, I hope this wasn't a breathless summary. There's a lot of reading, and I've written about this stuff, a lot of literature which underlies it. And this was my best effort to sort of do it in half an hour. And I hope, there's some clarity, but I could obviously, go back to these questions later. What does it mean to read together? So what does it mean to read together the distinct critical perspectives on the post-colonial, the decolonial, and the colonial that I have outlined? So they exist, but what does it mean to read them together? Now, I asked this question while making a confession. And the confession is the following. You see, I don't believe in marcos teóricos, in escuelas, maestras y maestros, in academic schools with their masters and divas. Instead, I approach theory and method as ways of asking questions, critical questions, questions asked in gripping conversations with the world, ever an interplay of concept and evidence, narrative and theory. I tell my students that, marcos teóricos don't just come at the beginning and then disappear through the rest of your thesis or your article. Marcos teóricos work badly for that reason. Theory and narrative have to work together. Concept and evidence have to mutually interrogate each other. So it is in this manner that I understand post-colonial perspectives and subaltern studies in critical yet cautious ways. I register their intellectual silences and theoretical tensions, which circulate amidst their formative plurality. I recognize the persistent contentions of the post-colonial and the subaltern as categories and perspectives. I register that the persistent contentions of the post-colonial and the subaltern as categories and perspectives register, once again, unproductive ambiguity. Sometimes they have productive ambiguities, but often they have unproductive ambiguities. Thus, as has been repeatedly emphasized, the concept of the post-colonial has rested upon the divide between the colonial and the post-colonial. So the colonial is the night and the post-colonial is the brilliant day. Here, one totalized, is the light of the day. Here, one totalized terrain, the colonial, leads to another undifferentiated arena, the post-colonial. What does this do? This serves to homogenize critical difference, instate historical hierarchy, post-colonial is better than the colonial, allied unequal social spaces, and sanitize, clean up post-colonial politics. If it's after the colonial, it has to be good. It looks away from the crucial task. It looks away from the crucial task of questioning simultaneously two sets of scandals. Los escándalos of the West and the nation, a point to which I shall return. Now, to state all this is far from a disparaging move. Rather, it can be to actually acknowledge the conditions of possibility of critical perspectives. And so it is also in this spirit that I turn now to a critical constructive reading of coloniality of power and decoloniality of knowledge. My first proposition is that this corpus is founded on presumptions of the innately dystopic nature of coloniality and the inherently ethically utopian possibilities of decoloniality. So there's something innately dystopic about coloniality, and there's something innately ethical, utopian about possibilities of decoloniality. These carry profound consequences for the politics of knowledge. I shall base my discussion around the arguments and implications of the Argentine philosopher resident in Mexico, Enrique Dussel, in order to unravel the emphases of the coloniality-decoloniality perspective, including especially of space and time. Crucial for Dussel are the writings of Emmanuel Levinas concerning ethics, alterity, and exteriority. For Levinas, as is generally known, the other, for Levinas, the other is a constitutive haunting presence, which relationally reveals the limits. For Levinas, the other is a constitutive haunting presence, which relationally reveals the limits and horizons of self. This happens in a way that, quote, ethics was the first philosophy. So ethics is the first philosophy rather than epistemology, or say the Heideggerian ontology of being. Now, this was Levinas. Now, Dussel transforms these innately emergent, necessarily non-empirical attributes. Dussel transforms these innately emergent, necessarily non-empirical attributes of the ethical encounter between the same and what forever remains exterior to it. Dussel transforms these into split and substantialized spaces with concrete geopolitical factual reference, namely Europe and Latin America. So for Levinas, the ethical encounter between the same and that which remains exterior to it is innately emergent, is necessarily non-empirical. This is transformed into something which is concretely geopolitical and factual, namely Europe and Latin America. So in this scenario, it is not only that Latin America is ever temporarily contemporaneous with Europe, Euro-America, revealing the dark side of Europe, Euro-America. It is also that Latin America, so it's not just contemporaneous, it is also that Latin America, a unitary space that includes as well the self of the philosopher, Dussel, is already always ethically ahead of Europe, which is a space of unethical hegemony, articulating always the colonial dimensions of modern power. Now, all this is crucial. Dussel's singular split between Europe and Latin America, alongside the exclusive emphasis on the coloniality of power, Dussel's singular split between Europe and Latin America was too pat, too ready, too quick, too tendentious. Unsurprisingly, it came to be supplanted soon by the geopolitical, spatial moral contrast between Europe, Euro-American hegemony, and the other, or subaltern side of colonial difference. Variously, this other or subaltern side of colonial difference was variously named as transmodernity, border knowledge, and decolonial perspectives. At the same time, these ethically segregated entities continue to enact within a shared historical stage a principal drama, an endless clash between good and bad, virtue and evil, morality and immorality. Moreover, while Dussel's original claims concerned a supersession of phenomenology by an ethically oriented politics, while Dussel's original claims concerned a supersession of phenomenology by an ethically oriented politics, recall Levinas's proclamation of ethics as first philosophy, under the decolonial, under the decolonial turn, the primacy of ethics and politics mean that they appear combined, elided, implicitly and a priori with epistemology and ontology, reading, writing, and being, becoming, as ways of knowing and acting, an antidote to authority before the dystopia of power. Put differently, the subaltern side of colonial difference has principled precedence and always triumphs over the coloniality of power. Here, decolonial scholars not only take the side of, but are already the same as critical bearers of subjugated knowledges, all inhabitants of geopolitical margins. As we shall see once again, this has immense import. Put simply, I have been excited by the problems proffered, but uncertain about the answer offered by the decoloniality of knowledge, coloniality of power, body of knowledge. The point now is that such attempts, mine included, to simultaneously think through the limitations and potentialities of critical perspectives is to resist from treating these as privileged, exclusive inquiries. As la escuela poscolonial, estudios subalternos, el giro decolonial in mayúsculas, always given, already in place. I mean, if we only have to follow them, what is left for us to do? Instead, it is to approach these knowledges, these perspectives as critical rubrics that bear productive articulation with other theoretical orientations and political understandings. Consider here the rethinking of empire in historical anthropology and other disciplines. Read together carefully with postcolonial and decolonial, understandings. Important here have been prior pointers to the prior and persistent play of colonial schemes in contemporary worlds. These emphases have highlighted the immense import and ongoing influence of the enmeshments between enlightenment and empire, race and reason, the metropolis and the margins, and religion and politics. Moreover, all this has suggested newer understandings of community, history, and identity, which have challenged prior modular conceptions of these categories, entities of identity, history, community. Furthermore, cautiously reading together distinct critical perspectives is to register the scandal of the West. Cautiously reading together distinct critical perspectives is to register the scandal of the West. And I confess to this being a coinage of mine. That is the place of an imaginary yet palpable West, un occidente muy imaginario pero totalmente tangible, the place of an imaginary yet palpable West as history, modernity, democracy, reason, and destiny for each culture, every society, and all people. Yet, such scandal of the West has to be always conjoined with the recognition, with recognizing the scandal of the nation. And what is the scandal of the nation? Persistent projections of the nation as the harbinger of progress and development, realized or failed. The nation and state as harbinger of progress and development, which anxiously ignore and shamefully deny the broken promises of freedom and the undemocratic foundations of democracy. The anxious ignorance here and the shameful denial of the broken promises of freedom and the undemocratic foundations of democracy, not just here or there, but everywhere we look. On the one hand, all of this is to register the terms and limits of state, nation, and citizen in Western and non-Western worlds, prudently underscoring the significance of critical difference in such entangled terrain. On the other hand, it is to recognize that the scandals of the West, the nation, it is to recognize the scandals of the West, the nation, and other tales of progress are not just ideological aberrations, ideological mistakes, or mere objects of knowledge. Rather, these scandals are constitutive conditions of our worlds, of their knowing, experiencing, and living. Finally, all of this is to approach colonialism, modernity, and nation. All of this is to approach colonialism, modernity, and nation, but also the post-colonial, decolonial, and academic disciplines as necessarily contradictory, contingent, and contended procedures and perspectives. This includes the interplay between the analytical and the hermeneutic, between the modern subjects and subjects of modernity, questions that I've discussed elsewhere and now defer to the discussion ahead. Okay, so what does, I'm close to the end. So what does all this mean practically? What does all this mean practically for claims for the decolonial, calls to decolonize? What does all this mean practically for the claims for the decolonial, calls to decolonize, especially within academia? First, might we carefully question the easy equation between academics and activism? How are we to understand the privilege, entitlement, and hierarchy of different kinds and of different levels at stake and play in academic arenas as part of everyday worlds? How do we democratically understand our own knowledge and expertise, its privileged, often scholastic claims? What is the place here of less the mediation? What is the place here less of the mediation and more the immediation and cancel culture of social media? Do these need to be understood not as simple errors, but as vital attributes of our lived present? By turning the colony and colonialism into an exclusive wound, a ready rupture, do we not underplay thereby the different registers of the colonial and the modern, including often our own complicities in regimes of power? Should we not insist on the overlapping ways in which the colony feeds into the nation? Is it the case that different calls to decolonize or affirm minority voices? Is it the case that different calls to decolonize or affirm minority voices can appear as uncertainly turned to the redemptive nature, sorry, I'll repeat it. Is it the case that different calls to decolonize or affirm minority voices can appear as uncertainly turned to the redemptive nation and the multicultural state? What is the place here of the readily legible liberal radical subject and the always given liberal progressive settlement, including their insistence that the indigenous and the ex-slave perform an impossible difference to live up to their identity? And yet, how is difference, alterity, articulated, and power, authority assumed here? This brings me to two sets of critical questions which I've been asking for a long time. On the one hand, what is at stake in critically exploring terms of power and dominant knowledges without turning these into totalized terrain? How are we to learn from, yet reach beyond newer critical orthodoxies that render dominant categories as dystopian totalities? Put differently, what are the terms and textures of understanding power as shaped by difference, of authority as inflected by alterity? On the other hand, in front are issues turning on tradition and community, the local and the subaltern, as innately oppositional concepts and entities. Must such contending categories of the local, the subaltern, tradition, community inhabit the locus, the place of unrecuperated particulars, as a priori antidotes to authority in the mirrors of critical understandings? How are we to express and articulate the dense sensuousness and the acute mix-ups of social life? Can this be done to question modular schemes of ordering the world, to think through axiomatic projections of resistant difference? Put simply, what is at stake in understanding the determination of difference? What is at stake in understanding the determinations of difference as stamped by the productivity of power, of subaltern formations as bearing the impress of dominant designs? Neither power nor difference, neither authority nor neither power nor difference, neither authority nor alterity are pure after all. Where am I going with all this? In terms of the decolonial, of calls to decolonize, consider the modern enactments in the settler colonies, from Australia to South Africa to the Americas, including the Caribbean. Consider the modern enactments in these settler colonies of expropriation, apartheid, indenture, slavery, emancipation with its burden of freedom. We have to comprehend here different forms, not only of innately hierarchical exclusion, but also of profoundly unequal inclusion and their consequences. And in between, there is the place and presence of 20th century nations and nationalisms, not just the fascists and Stalin, but also Israel in Palestine. And in between, there's the place and presence of 20th century nations and nationalisms, not just the fascists and Stalin, but also Israel in Palestine and India in Kashmir and other elsewheres. These bid us to face up to many intractable questions of extermination. Such are the tracks and traces of colony and nation, of power and difference, of authority and alterity, of discipline and desire. This brings me to the very end. Elsewhere, I have discussed how the dichotomy between the primitive and the civilized define the beginnings of history and anthropology as modern institutionalized knowledges, and of the humanities and social sciences more broadly. On the one hand, we know that the dichotomy of the primitive and the civilized has been left behind by salient strands of critical knowledge. On the other hand, in newer and older avatars, the antinomy and its implications, particularly through hierarchies of otherness, continue to haunt, surreptitiously and otherwise, our worlds at large. Indeed, the point hardly bears emphasis in the ruins we inhabit, including Donald Trump's shithole countries. And so, what might be considered as the tasks ahead? First, to explore together the colonial, the post-colonial, and the decolonial suggests the importance of staying with and thinking through their presumptions and productivities, complicities and segregation. To stay with and think through all this by approaching the post-colonial, the decolonial, and the colonial as disciplines of modernity. Moreover, this means registering the acute limits of readily splitting apart the knowing subject from its object of inquiry. Rather, it is to consider them, ourselves, and that conjointly, often uneasily, by tracking mutual illuminations and interrogations of each other. The ways in which the subject and object come together and fall apart. This includes our accounts of emergent worlds, worlds made and unmade today by precarities and pandemics, the non-human and the Anthropocene. Finally, here are requirements of being vigilant. Here are requirements of being vigilant regarding the burdens of the past, rather than simply stressing the novelty of the present, particularly our own academic work. The contemporary arrogance that overplays the uniqueness of our own times, of our own scholarship. For it is in these ways that we can better respond to the probing, quotidian questions that are said to have punctuated the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty's seminars. So, Merleau-Ponty would interrupt these really abstract discussions in philosophy by asking his students, where are we? What time is it? Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for this conference. Muchas gracias por esta conferencia. Con tantas cosas para discusión y poner en juego estos conceptos. Pero antes como moderadora no quiero tomar la palabra, abro para las preguntas. Las preguntas pueden ser en español o en inglés, ¿verdad?
Sí, claro.
Saurabh,
Sí.
¿prefieres?
Sí.
Ok.
No.
Questions could be
inglés,
in
español,
either
Hindi,
Spanish or English. Muchas gracias.
In Hindi, Chhattisgarhi, Marathi as well.
Okay, in other languages.
And Bengali if you wish, but no French, no German. Perdón. No
Okay.
alemán, no francés.
Alemán y no francés. Bueno, ese es nuestro límite. Muy bien, Carlos. Si puedes abrir tu micrófono, Carlos Arroyo,
Sí, muchas
por
gracias.
favor.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I had only two questions. The first was on, you spoke of 3 stages of subaltern studies. I was wondering if you could tell us where you think subaltern studies is now. And if you could say that, or this is an opinion, and if the spreading of the discourse of decolonization in popular discourse has helped or hurt subaltern studies. And the second is on your framing of ethics, following Levinas and Dussel. If you could speak a little more about what it means for the academy to carry out decolonizing praxis ethically, or whether it's its role to do so.
So come again, the second question is, how is it to, what are the terms of carrying out a decolonizing practice ethically?
It's a bit vague, my question. It's about what you think about the ethics of the praxis of academics. If you think that just the research equates decolonizing praxis.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much. The great questions. So, I'm glad you've spoken of the 3 stages of subaltern studies, because I didn't actually speak directly about it, but it is actually the case that there are 3 stages, with the first one being the reconstruction of the trajectories of the actions, practices, consciousness of subaltern groups, moving on next to interrogations of dominant knowledges of modernity and nation, to a third stage where they actually claimed, and this will answer part of your question, a third stage where they actually claimed that subaltern studies doesn't actually exist. Okay, but they continue to work. So how did the third happen? The third, I talked about the first 2. The third was present actually implicitly. So, Dipesh Chakravarti's book, Habitations of Modernity, the subtitle is Essays in the Wake of Subaltern Studies, right? And we know that the wake is what comes after, but the wake is also, when something is dead, you maintain a wake, right? You know the term for it, right? Where people get together and, kind of go over the loss. So it's Essays in the Wake of Subaltern Studies, and Partha Chatterjee, about 7 years ago or 8 years ago, wrote an article in Economic and Political Weekly, basically saying that, not providing a requiem, but sort of going over the past of subaltern studies and suggesting that it doesn't exist. But I think the question there is really of how subaltern studies, in some senses, has been, and this relates to your question of whether decolonization has helped subaltern studies. I think subaltern studies don't actually claim, the main guys, they don't actually claim that they exist in quite the way in which they existed as Cómo, un collective. It was a collective which produced 12 volumes, but several books in dialogue with each other. It was heterogeneous, much more heterogeneous than, for example, the coloniality of power, decoloniality of knowledge guys. They worked much more as a vanguardia, the Latin American group. So what the subaltern studies guys did really was, they now no longer, in a sense, function as, as that collective. They were always very heterogeneous, and they liked that heterogeneity. Unfortunately, this is what is missed out when people write about them as an escuela. The most important thing about subaltern studies is the formative heterogeneity, the constitutive not oneness of the group. You've got historians such as David Arnold and David Hardiman, who wrote, well, it was critical, empirical, historical work. And then, there's the philosophical history of Dipesh Chakravarti. There's a political theory of Partha Chatterjee. And, there's the work of Gautam Bhadra, who principally wrote in Bengali. That's Ishita's supervisor, who principally wrote in Bengali, densely empirical stuff. But in Bangla. So this heterogeneity is often missed out on. So where does it go? I think what happened with subaltern studies is, and they were happy about it, is the way in which it was taken over and translated in newer ways. And I don't think they minded. They didn't mind. They didn't want a clear, how should I say it? They didn't want, a clear, a loyalty to what was, to what was the party line. They liked the extensions. And so, when as subaltern studies was sort of winding up in an official sense, they were a group of Dalit, that's untouchable, ex-untouchable, Tamil people who organized, young people who organized a subaltern studies in Tamil conference. So the category had been taken over and made something else. And I suspect that more than Ishita, I have actually mangled and defaced subaltern studies, and yet they still accept me. They think I'm a little wacky, they think I'm a little mad, but they still accept me, as someone who's. So I think that's the productivity of it. If I've answered your question, it's less about what decolonization is doing with subaltern studies, but what. Whether it's helped subaltern studies, it's more about what subaltern studies, their productive critical insights, as well as their blindness, their silences might help these endeavors. Now, about the other question, and this relates then to the ethics of decolonizing practices. I have a simple answer there. I think academic work is very, very important. And, it's my vocation, it's my life, but it's also in some senses, Carlos, it's about recognizing that we have to be real, that we have to question our own privilege, that we need to understand as well that just because we can speak a certain languages, when it comes to when it comes to strikes, when it comes to huelgas, when it comes to manifestaciones, and you go there, it's about recognizing that it's the people who make those movements who are important, not me or someone else who can speak the fancy language. Okay, and I think a very good example of someone who combined these two roles as organizer as organizer and as activist was David Graeber, who unfortunately died recently. And, he was a maverick, a madman. I met him, we got along very, very well. But I mean, he was madder than I am, much madder than I am. But he actually combined this kind of practice, including questioning, his own privilege. The trouble with David was that he was also very certain of what he believed in. But that went with his anarchism. That went with his politics. So, but you have to accept it. You can't just reject someone like that. And I'm using him as an example. You cannot, it's about how, how accepting we are, not pointing fingers, but seeing the possibilities along with the problems. I don't know if I've answered the question, but.
Yes. Thank you.
Gracias. ¿No?
Muchas gracias. Tenemos varias preguntas que están llegando por YouTube y también tengo una pregunta de Caterina Camastra, es una investigadora de la UDIR. La voy a leer porque tiene un poquito de problemas de conexión. Y ella dice, in my translation courses, I encourage my students to think of possible translation between marginalized languages without necessarily passing through an hegemonic language. How do you think translation plays a role in decolonizing thought? Esta es la pregunta de Caterina.
Muchas gracias, Caterina. It's a great question. Thank you. So when I have just in order to better understand and answer your question, when you say you translate from marginalized languages into other languages without going through the hegemonic, what are the languages you're translating from, and which languages are you translating into? I mean, it's can you hear me?
Yes, she can listen to you, and she's going to answer now.
Okay, perdón.
Está en el chat, ahora lo estoy leyendo.
Okay.
Dice,
okay, I've got it here. Possible translation between while without silly passing through an hegemonic language. Okay, between, across marginalized languages. Okay. You know, about the second part of your question, how do you think translation plays a role in decolonizing thought? I have not read all on the decolonization stuff. And in fact, I've read mainly, you know, the estrellas, the hegemonic stars of the decolonial turn, from Walter to Nelson Maldonado Torres. So I don't know. I mean, there's talk about how Quechua, for example, is important. How indigenous languages in Bolivia are important. But I haven't actually seen them use these languages very much. I mean, I know that Walter, for example, reads Codices, and he possibly has Nahuatl, but I'm not certain in terms of the decolonial turn how this has been played out. But it's a really you know, it's a really interesting question you've asked, and now I see that, you know, it's a project of translation from Zapotec to Pulpecha, if I can pronounce it right. But here's the thing, you know, I work principally between history and anthropology, and questions of translation have come up again and again in my work on evangelical entanglements between Euro-American missionaries and Central Indian converts. And there are a whole set of issues there. So one part of it is that I'm very glad that, you know, you're treating questions of translation as hands-on, as something which has to be done and which is done. Because, you know, we're reminded of that old question in translation theory, which is translation possible? No, translation is impossible. You know, but you know that, you know, it was actually George Steiner who said translation is not just possible. Translation happens. Translation happens because it's done. People live by its fallible wisdom and its infallible knowledge. Because this gets me to the point, the translation is, after all, tied to concrete practices. The history of the Bible is a history of translation. You know, going back to the Greek Synoptic Gospels, going to the Vulgate, going to King James, going to, you know, the other editions other translations which I have looked at in Chhattisgarhi, in Hindi, and so on. So what is happening here? This question that translation is impossible rests on the presumption of looking, or the search for a perfect text which is translated by a perfect translator in a perfect language for a perfect reader. But such perfection is not of this world, or at least it should not be. Perfection, translation is immaculate. It's not immaculate. You know, ever since not just the Tower of Babel, but actually going back to the Garden of Eden. Okay, you're looking for a language, the perfect language before the fall. But are these presumptions of the world, or should they be? So I think your encouragement is fabulous, particularly if the student can actually carry out this project of translation. What I have found actually in a much more modest fashion is that the very making of a vernacular, of a Chhattisgarhi Christianity in this large but obscure region in the middle of India, the very making of a Chhattisgarhi Christianity, a native Christianity, turned the terms of the Christianity of the missionaries into something else. And this was an act of translation. But they could not escape. This was not a vernacular version which was apart from the hegemonic one. They had to play upon the hegemonic in order to create which was their own. And this was my point, that, alterity, subalternity is always inflected by power. Power, for academics, we can see power as something terrible far away, but it actually exists. It's concrete, it's palpable. It's in language, it's in thought, it's in images, it's in smells. So can we recognize that, rather than turning everything into something which is, how should one put it, something which is cerebral? Can we make it, concrete? The smells, the colors, the power, the power not just of argument, but power as that which not just gazes, but that grasps, right? So I don't know if I've answered your question, but thank you very much for the question. I mean, there's more I can say. I'm just like containing myself, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dube. We have another question, Fernanda. Please.
Sí, bueno, quisiera preguntar en español para no enredarme, pero si algo no queda claro, pues mejor, porque tampoco es como que yo lo tenga muy claro, ¿no? Realmente es algo que llevo pensando desde tiempo y que no sé cómo, me gustaría saber su opinión, o sea, cómo ligar este aspecto, pues no sé si llamarlo práctico, o más bien de lo real, que a este pensamiento o a esta forma de pensar lo colonial o lo decolonial, lo poscolonial. Por ejemplo, ¿no? No sé si este arte o esta literatura o todo esto que se da en lo marginal o en lo diferente o en lo no hegemónico, se vuelva entonces como ese rostro del otro, que en Levinas, de manera que no solamente se vuelva la pregunta sobre su validez en términos epistemológicos o de qué tanto vale en el conocimiento o qué tanto aporta al conocimiento moderno o a otro tipo de conocimiento, sino que en función de a quién le sirve, ¿no? O sea, esto perdura o esto dura o esto sirve para alguien o por qué se utiliza o por qué alguien lo utiliza, y si eso nos llevaría entonces a la pregunta sobre ese otro, ¿no? Sería como el rostro de ese otro que está allá en el fondo, detrás, y que también debería de importarnos y que deberíamos de reconocer en todo caso, o más bien sería por otro lado o usted más bien iría por otro lado o respondería de otra manera esa pregunta.
I mean, if I've understood your question, and correct me if I haven't, but I think that your question is on different registers. So one part of it is what is the utility of thought. The other part of it is hegemonic, non-hegemonic. I'll begin with the second part of it. I wouldn't want to call it, I wouldn't necessarily want to consider, go into what is hegemonic, what is non-hegemonic, because here, in some senses, it's about labels. So that one can say, if I've asked this question to one of my friends, a prominent decolonial, and I said, but you're talking about if all of Europe and European philosophical thought is the same, and all, what happens, for example, to the dissidents who existed in Britain at the time of Locke? What happens to the levelers and diggers? And what happens then to Spinoza? What happens to Gandhi? And with the response of the Vaca Sagrada, Decolonial, who's a very good friend, was, Saurabh, your questions are historical. I'm a philosopher. Now, the point is, that's a way of saying hegemonic, non-hegemonic. European, hegemonic, non-hegemonic is elsewhere. I want to learn from Spinoza. I want to go back to the time when I was 18 or 19 and I read Christopher Hill on the dissident sects and levelers and diggers who wanted to take over who didn't want their lands, their commons to go away. That was the time when the enclosures were coming up. That was in part the beginning of primitive accumulation. What we are seeing now in terms, the logics of capital and exploitation, somewhere along at least in part, go over there. So am I going to stay with the levelers and diggers? Am I going to stay with Milton? Am I going to stay with Spinoza? Am I going to read them together also with Gandhi? So, I'm not so interested in defining the hegemonic and non-hegemonic. I think I'm more interested in looking at what challenges in meaningful ways, what speaks back to power and what challenges usual ways of seeing and understanding. And this is true of, art in a very significant way. It's not just about thought. And, it takes us back to this question of the aspect of the privileging of the conceptual over that which exists. The art philosopher W.J.T. Mitchell has a very powerful argument, so that it's not, you mentioned images, it's not just how we study images in hegemonic and non-hegemonic ways. Mitchell asked this question: what is it that pictures want? What is it that images desire? Can they speak to you? If you let them speak to you? That's the power of color and smell. I'm more interested in that question. And that gets me to the last one about the utility of thought. And, you're not confused at all. It's a question which has been with me. My first round of research for my PhD, and which became the first book of, was in a very large, heretical, very lower caste, untouchable community. Okay. And, in the end, I constructed a history of the group. Most of them couldn't read it. Even if it were the levels of literacy are so low that it has not been translated because it's not considered a politically correct book. But what it did was, I did field work. I went back to oral narratives, oral narratives of the community. But when the middle class, people, middle class members of the community who are literate read the book, they were upset. Because I go to the oral narratives and say that, the first guru or preceptor of the sect, the founder of the sect, was a landless laborer. And these guys said, no. He was actually a landlord. Now, I'm not creating this. And, this is like a Brahmanical conspiracy. Now, the point of it is, and they actually set up a website, this was 20 years ago, drenched in blood, where my blood was evidently coming down. Now I could say that it's wrong history, okay? But I think it's about the ironies of the inequalities which we live with. Have I helped the hegemonic or the non-hegemonic? I wrote what I thought was an honest history, a critical history and anthropology. But the end result is that for the people who could read the book, in part, they hated it. The millions of others simply couldn't read it. I still hope, the entire book lies in translation in Hindi. I hope that matters would change enough that it'll be published in the next few years. But I don't know what the reaction would be. And that relates also to Carlos's question and to the one about translations between languages. In some senses, we do not have authority or control over what we do, which is why, and this might sound like a cop-out, this might sound just like very sentimental, but I think that's where honesty, as critical honesty towards ourselves, and the ability to laugh at what we do and to look at it ironically, I think is important, even crucial. Sorry, my answers are not always academic, huh? Not strictly academic.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. We have some questions in YouTube. Juan Francisco Basigalupo Araya pregunta, the question is, where can we locate the epistemologies of the South by Boaventura de Sousa Santos?
Great question. Perdón, what is the name? Who is this? Who asked the question?
Where can we locate?
No, I want the name. I got the question. Sorry, Mariana. What is the name of?
Juan Francisco Basigalupo.
Okay. Muchas gracias, Juan Francisco. I mean, you know, I must tell you that I first heard, I always get his name wrong, Buenaventura. The first time I heard him was in Guadalajara, and I didn't know very much. This is very early on, and I didn't know much about his work. And I was, I was basically like, wow, you know, he's looking at the connections between the North and the South. He's not just privileging the South. And I still admire him, and I think he's very much about the epistemologies of the South. This is not a critique, but this is my way. You know, it ultimately goes back to the fact that I work somewhere between, history, anthropology, social theory, etc. I can't abandon the archive in the field. So it's not a problem. I learned from him, but I wonder if, yes, he's very much a central part of epistemologies of the South, from whom I've learned a great deal. But a lot of my talk actually has been about its spirit, its espiritu, its alma has been about whether we can seek questions only epistemologically, principally in terms of conceptual categories. How do we let the world, in terms of its smells, colors, in terms of its rottenness, break upon our thought? Okay, I've learned, I've learned a great deal from him. But I learned from him and then take it elsewhere and say, okay, so this is what I've learned from him. But how do I translate this learning into other kinds of questions, into forms which also become a kind of an unlearning as I seek to bring concepts, in dialogue with worlds. Otherwise, I'm reminded here of actually a film by Kurosawa called The Seven Samurai. Mm-hmm. And, there are two aspects to The Seven Samurai. They are continuously practicing strokes, and they do eventually go into battle, in the film. But a lot of it is the practicing of the strokes, right? So, I just don't want to be left behind only practicing my strokes, which are epistemic. I'm not saying Buenaventura does that. What I want to do is, I just want those, the nastiness and the pleasures, the everyday little pleasures of the world and its larger nastiness to break upon what I do. ¿Está bien?
Yo creo que sí. Juan Francisco, si puedes poner tu respuesta, pero we have other comments. Ronald Day says, thank you, Dr. Dube. That was a good and useful talk. Thank you too to the organizer for making this available. So congratulations for Ronald Day. We have another question.
Rohan Day.
Ronald Day.
Ronald Day. Okay.
Ajá.
Muchas gracias, Ronald.
Y Donají Portillo, there is a question. How to study and analyze ethnography or internal colonialism through decolonization and post-colonization perspectives?
How to understand internal colonization?
To study and analyze ethnography or internal colonialism through decolonization and post-colonization perspective. So the post-colonial perspective.
Well, I'm going to be, this is actually, it might seem as if I'm being dismissive, Donahi, but this is really, this is, this might seem dismissive, but it's actually the gist of what I've been saying. I'm sure there are various ways of doing it. There are actually various ways of doing it. And I could outline a few, but I think the real answer is the way to ethnographically study internal colonization, through decolonization, post-colonialism, etc., is to actually go ahead and do it. And this is what I was talking about. It's to actually take on the challenge. We can outline many ways of doing this thing, but it's through the actual practice of doing that one learns, that one undoes, and one learns what are the possibilities, what are the trials. I know it doesn't sound like an adequate answer, but honestly, if you were to tell me, okay, internal colonization, where? What are you looking at? I'd be able to better answer the question. But in terms of a general pronouncement, how do we, I'm just not good at, I'm just not good at coming up with kind of blueprints, in terms of abstract scenarios.
Thank you. Francisco, ¿cómo se llama? Juan Francisco Pasigalupo responde que thanks for the answer. I find it great to think beyond just epistemology, but value their contributions.
Absolutely with you. You summarized my answer. I could have made it much shorter, just putting it that I really value them. But, they are also, it's not just the limits of epistemology, it's actually the limits of the conceptual, the merely conceptual. Because, to me, it spells in some senses, one can speak about hegemonic, non-hegemonic, Western, non-Western thought, but in some senses, to what extent are we making everything conceptual? And in what ways is that emphasis on the conceptual, the purely cerebral, to what extent is it turning matters into, scholasticism? And I'm not referring to scholasticism, as that sterile body of thought which was named for the late medievals by the Renaissance scholar. I mean modern scholasticism. I mean, the scholasticism which doesn't look at the embodied. And here I'm getting to the questions all of you have asked, so please bear with me. I'm referring to I've spoken about colors and smells, but what I'm saying is, what about concept? What about epistemology that is affective, not just emotional, but that is affective, that is embodied? Why does it have to be also, does it have to be conceptual? And that's modern scholasticism, because then in some senses, it misses out on the conditions of possibility which make our thought possible. One of the things which the decolonials pointed towards was that thought doesn't happen in abstraction. They pointed in some senses that thought comes from somewhere, that it is about, that otherwise you have a privileged view from somewhere, which becomes the authoritative vista for everywhere. That is the problem with certain forms of, if you will, the view from Europe. But what I also want to say is that there are split Europes, and I want to approach them not just empirically, but critically. I mean, Blake matters a great deal to me. Okay? William Blake matters a great deal to me. Can we think actually of not just Spinoza, but can we think actually of, and this is not my field, Mariana, it's not my field, I just read these guys, but what happens when, when one converses with a Picasso? What happens actually when, what happens when you recognize that you recognize that there is a certain, that this split aspect about different worlds points as well to forms of what one can consider out of romanticism, out of critical romanticism, as forms of a melancholy realism. This is the melancholy realism which is actually questioned, the horrors of accumulation and capital which we live under, the horrors of race as well, always imperfectly. And yet, there was, but are we to reject Blake because he wrote of, we shall build a new Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant lands? I don't think so, right? So, so this is what gets me, we think of knowledge as perfect. We want our knowledge, to be non-contradictory. We want it to be, to be immaculate, basically. And I think ultimately it's a kind of a biblical vision before the fall, before the Tower of Babel, before, Noah and his ark. We're looking for this perfect language, this perfect ideology. And, I'm not just saying that this is because people are Christian. I'm saying this is what I was trained in. We want our knowledge to be without ambiguity. We want our knowledge to be without contradiction. We want our knowledge, when we find someone as ambiguous and contradictory, you point particularly in, the field I was trained in history. You find an argument which is contradictory and you say, oh, there's the contradiction and therefore the entire thesis falls. But worlds are contradictory. Right? Worlds are ambiguous, they're ambivalent. So why should our knowledge of it? I mean, this doesn't mean that, you do a right anything. This is actually thinking about how we, this is about considering, whether, what kind of, I believe in facts, okay? I believe in facts and in a strident commitment to facts. So, this is not all, but where I differ from my historian colleagues is that they believe in facts, I say yes, but I also want to construe, I want to find facts unexpected. I want to find facts which speak in the uneasy echoes of limiting doubt, rather than deal in the same old dead certainties. When was Zapata born? I mean, who cares? It's honestly, whether it's 1 year or one month or 1 month before or 1 month after. I mean, I don't even know if there's controversy around Zapata. But you know what I'm saying? What about facts unexpected? And that's the big set of facts about for example, I'll give you one instance that, which is being recognized now, but for years it's been known that, Woodrow Wilson, after whom that great school in Princeton is named, systematically was a racist. He systematically destroyed a Black middle class in the US South, right? Now, this was known, and yet this becomes a fact unexpected, because you say, so, how do we tell the story of American democracy? When you bring in the aspect of slavery, which is coming in now, which existed, those were unexpected facts once, which spoke in terms of lingering doubt, rather than dealing in the ready certainties of, the greatness of American democracy. And, I can come up with, this is not just the US, I can come up with any number of examples from Indian history. Why is it that we shy away from recognizing that, given, of course it was given his time, Gandhi was a racist in South Africa. The great Mahatma Gandhi was, he didn't like the Kafirs. He fought for the Indians, but the Kafirs, which is the pejorative terms like Negroes for the Blacks, came in a lower idea of civilization for him. Now, I think rather than saying, oh, Gandhi was a bad man, I think the question is how the set of ideas, including his vegetarianism, including his romanticism, his anti-modernism, were tied to the hierarchies of civilization which existed in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. I mean, those are the questions for intellectual history, critical intellectual history, which are not about naming, finger pointing, defending, rejecting. It's about registering is that, sorry, you must stop too much.
Thank you. We have another question from YouTube, and it's Juliana Romero, and she asks if you can use postcolonialism to study or to analyze Latin American literature.
Okay, so I could try and answer this. So the question would be, postcolonialism is very, very large. And I have a very capacious understanding of the postcolonial, okay? So I actually include people who wouldn't be considered as postcolonials at all. The anthropologist, historian, and Laura Stoller, who's very gringa, but who has asked very interesting questions about the archives and sexuality and gender in Southeast Asia. I consider here, I read the postcolonial not just in terms of, ethnic affiliations, national origins, ethnic kind of identifications. It's about the kinds of questions you ask. I certainly include, Jean and John Komaroff, who are white Jewish from South Africa, as postcolonial. And, there is a concrete aspect to this. So they've been very kind to me, but, after my first visit to South Africa, I met them and they said, so how was Cape Town? They're from Cape Town. Okay, I mean, they're much older. So I said it was great. And, I discovered the connections between Argentina as, with the British presence, Argentina, India, and South Africa. And how I discovered it? Through sanitary fittings. It's only in these countries where the British were that you had these flush systems which were high up on the walls, and in Britain, okay? And, I told them with a delighted way that, that there are these connections which we can do through a post-colonial understanding of sanitary fittings. Now, what I'm trying to say is basically the following. It's which version of the post-colonial, what kind of post-colonial understandings you want to take up, and which literatures you want to study. So sure, I mean, in terms of if you're looking at certain bodies of, which body of Latin American literature, I don't know, but you can certainly look at the question of, certain forms of writing in terms of Bhabha's notions of hybridity and mimicry. You can certainly look at, if you're talking about literature, there are all kinds of questions which have been asked in relation to traveling theory, which Mary Louise Pratt has asked, which can be used. I consider her a post-colonial. So it depends on, a lot depends actually on the bodies of material we approach. Once again, I say, I'm strictly, I don't like Marcos Teorico. So post-colonialism for me is not a Marco Teorico. It's a way of asking questions, and there are several ways of asking questions within post-colonial theory, and it's not a marketplace of ideas. It's what compels you, what excites you. How can you take it and ask, draw upon it to ask critical questions of the text you're studying, setting up a conversation, a critical conversation between the text and the concept. Is that something of an answer?
Yes, I think only Donahi asked, she comments that she was asking about ethnography of LGBT, LGBT discourse by mainstream in Mexico, or the idea of imposing the term Afro-Mexicano to all Black Mexicans, regardless of their cultural identity. Or, of course, the internal colonialism and its appliance right now in the pandemic. She's not trying to find the perfect frame, but she's asking this in that kind.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, Donahi, I didn't get, some of the question was lost in translation, and not just in translation, but it was lost in translation in terms of the media we are using, if we were sitting in a room, you could have grabbed me by my collar and said, you haven't understood my question, you can't do that now. So there's this kind of distance. But yeah, concretely then, there are questions of identity, there are questions of, I didn't get the aspect of the LGBT. I would actually, quite frankly, it's good to read as much as you can, but I think I would much rather go to, in terms of the ethnography of the LGBT community, I would much rather actually go to critical strands of gay and lesbian studies, particularly gay and lesbian studies which deal with questions of color and race. There is fabulous work which is being done by indigenous feminists on these questions. I think there's much more there to be found than, for example, in the decolonial or postcolonial. Sorry, I'm probably insulting, my friends, but I don't think, I think we have to look for the bodies of literature which speak to our questions. In terms of the Afro descendants, and whether all Mexicans, should be categorized. No, categorically no. That is then the regime and the terror of identities. That's the terror of naming. So I'm with you, but I think this can be done not just in terms of, that is the problem also that's also the problem in some senses with Marcos Theoricus. What exists in the world has to be explained in terms of a Marco Theorico, rather than trying to see what exists in the world in terms of the terror of identities, in this case, of all Blacks being identified in a particular way by the nation. This is actually, this is the scandal of the nation. So, so I'm going to be naughty and say, so read me on the question of the scandal of the West and the nation. It might have certain kinds of suggestions for you. No, I'm not saying that seriously. What I'm trying to say is that, that I wouldn't take out the answers from Marcos Theoricus.
Well, thank you very much. We have other congratulations, and we are running out of time, but we want to congratulate you for your conference, to thanks for the ideas. I think it's very complex, and this you are always in between in this anthropology, history, and the subaltern ideas that we need to question them and to try to organize our subjects and our research, in order to have these answers. And I think you illuminate these three questions that we have and are very used now, Poscolonial, lo decolonial, lo poscolonial, lo colonial. Now we are in this post-pandemic sphere, what we are going to do also with this new, what we are going to face, we are going to question, o podemos cuestionar nuevamente, estos conceptos, como dices, buscar no solo marcos, sino también conceptos que ayuden a encontrar lo que está ahí, el mismo mundo, de los...
Claro, and I think, claro, and I think, I've always thought like this, but I think the pandemic and the worlds which we have lived, particularly, with what's going on in India, but right now, but elsewhere, as well. I think what we have is a certain call, to be less conceited, to be less sure about our concepts, about our categories, about our Marcos Theoricus. This doesn't mean to stop work. It just means to be more honest at some level. Well done.
No, thank you very much. I think we can talk about this in so in more seminars. We need 3, 4, or 50 seminars to talk about this.
You know, one more and you'll be tired of me, Mariana.
No, thank you. I think we have to think together about the next things we are going to happen, what is happening in India, what is happening in Mexico, how to deal with the feminicidios, how to deal with racism, how to deal with the pandemic. I don't know, we need to question the powers to the institution, the state. I think we need to think a lot. So thank you very much, because now we are thinking a lot. Estamos pensando muchísimo.
No, muchas gracias, un privilegio, y a todos, mil gracias.
Pues muchísimas gracias al doctor Saurabh Dube por estar en nuestro seminario. Muchas gracias a todos y todas por estar compartiendo este seminario, y a los que nos han acompañado por YouTube y por Facebook. Muchas gracias, y les haremos llegar las preguntas y felicitaciones que estén por acá. Muchas gracias otra vez, y nos veremos pronto. Está abierto este espacio siempre para las preguntas y reflexiones. Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.